Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending today's Altair Global webinar, Momentum Survey Series, Lump Sum Edition, The Results. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us on this topic. Before we begin, I'd like to take just a quick moment to address one housekeeping item. This webinar has been approved for continuing education credits through Worldwide ERC and HRCI. Those activity IDs will be shared at the end of our webinar. All right, without further ado, let's get this started. Our first speaker on today's topic is joining me from Frisco, Texas, Mary Beth Nitz, Vice President of Global Consulting Services. Mary Beth, welcome and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to be here.
So we are all joining remotely today, and you may not actually be out of Frisco, Texas from our headquarters office. Where are you joining us from today?
Well, I'm about as close to the office in Frisco as possible. I'm in Plano, but only about 10 minutes from the office, so close enough.
Sure, and we are all joining remote today due to this COVID-19 virus and shelter-in-place orders. How is that affecting your work from home practices?
Well, Sarah, I always said that I probably could never be a teacher because I don't think I have that level of patience. But I'm kind of being forced to be a teacher right now and overseeing online education for all three of my school-age children. And then my new challenge that popped up today was working on getting a home gym set up for our son who is a competitive gymnast. So lots of challenges and just as busy as I was when I was in the office, just different challenges in our current normal or our new normal, as some might say.
It's been interesting to get the technology set up just right and make sure that, we are able to work just as efficiently and, kind of touches close to home for those who are relocating and trying to do the same thing throughout their assignments. Okay, here. And our next speaker joining us is Russ Haynie, Director of Global Consulting Services. How are you today, Russ?
I'm wonderful, Sarah. Thank you.
Great, awesome. Thank you for joining. So tell us from your perspective, how has the coronavirus and shelter-in-place orders been affecting you?
Well, for me, for the last 20 years, 19 of the last 20 years, I've worked at home and worked remotely. So that part really isn't a big deal. Here in Atlanta, where I'm based, we're seeing a lot of the same changes everyone else is. The city is really shut down. Really optimistic, though. I see a lot of creativity, a lot of local businesses kind of pivoting to different business models, restaurants doing kind of takeout service. So I'm trying to, support those local businesses as much as possible. I think for the mobility industry, we're all going to have to pivot just like all the other businesses right now. But I'm, as I said, I'm optimistic because, Mary Beth, I'm sure you would agree, we've seen this industry kind of pivot and adapt so many times over in our career, and I'm sure it's going to happen again. And I'm also optimistic because I know the professionals in this industry, and especially those that have signed up to listen to this webinar. So with that, I would say, why don't we pivot and talk about lump sum payments, shall we? So first, I'd like to do a bit of level setting on the concept of lump sums. How are they used? And we've listed here that they can be used in several ways. One is as an individual policy component or benefit. And in that way, this is the most traditional way that we've seen lump sums be used in mobility policies. And it's really to cover a small number of specific relocation expenses. The most common targets have been things like home finding trips, temporary living expenses, or final move trip expenses. Those things tend to lend themselves very well to budgeting and setting up lump sum payments and have traditionally been very successfully targeted for lump sum payments. It can also be used as a major policy component or benefit. And in that way, the lump sum payment is intended to cover the majority of relocation expenses. Oftentimes, companies might carve out a benefit or two that are more complex or less likely to lend themselves to being wrapped into the lump sum payment. Sometimes you'll see companies hold out, for instance, the household goods shipment, maybe temporary living if it's hard to kind of predict how much temporary living somebody will need up front. Sometimes you'll see that carved out. And then lastly, you may see lump sum payments being used as a standalone policy where they are intended to cover all relocation expenses. And you might see that at lower level policies, college grad policies, inexperienced hire policies, profiles of employees that we can reasonably expect to have less moving parts and less complexity in their moves. So we've seen them used successfully in that way. I want to say, too, that what we're not talking about today are miscellaneous expense allowances or relocation allowances. That is also a traditional part of mobility policy. But for today's purposes, we're really talking more about the true lump sum payments that are targeting specific benefits, not allowances that are targeting miscellaneous expenses. On the next slide, we're going to cover options for calculating and administering lump sum payments. First, flat amounts may be used, and we see this sometimes used with those lower level policies where there's not a lot of moving parts, and it's easier to predict what those lump sum amounts, appropriate amounts, could be without creating a lot of shortfalls and windfalls. So that's certainly one option that can be used. I'd say at the other end of the spectrum, companies opt into the services of providers that specialize in calculating lump sums individually to take into account the to and from location, the cost of goods and services at that point in time, the family size, the homeowner versus renter status, all of that array of kind of criteria that can influence the need for funds. The con of that approach is that it costs money to use the services of those providers. And so that dissuades some companies from going to that extreme. And in the middle of the road is, there are options to construct kind of an internal calculation. You can think of it as kind of a matrix of amounts that take into account those variables like family size, move distance, or the status of the employee as a homeowner versus a renter. And we've had great success partnering with companies to develop those kind of customized calculators. It does require some diligence on the part of the company to revisit those amounts and make sure they're appropriate over time. But that's definitely a great kind of compromise, middle of the road solution. And when we talk about administering lump sums, again, it can be a cash allowance paid to the employee up front. And that really puts the onus of budgeting expenses within that payment on the employee. And that can be done very successfully in some situations. But a lot of companies today are moving toward more of a managed budget or managed lump sum approach, whereby the employee is not really provided the money as a cash payment up front, but rather they're asked to work within that budget and partner with service providers to coordinate specific services within that budget. And I'm not going to get too much in the weeds on that concept. We'll cover it more later in the presentation, but that's definitely another option that we're seeing. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Beth.
Great. Thank you, Russ. So appreciate you setting the stage and making sure we're all on a level playing field in terms of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to take it a step further and talk about the ways that companies see lump sums as being a friend. So the positives of lump sum programs. The first, which I think is pretty obvious, and I think a lot of the reason why companies will pursue or consider implementing a lump sum is employee flexibility. From a corporate perspective, giving the employee a lump sum gives that employee total control over those funds. They have the flexibility to spend those funds on whatever services and benefits they want to spend them on. There's also a component of ease of administration on the corporate from the corporate perspective. Basically, makes it easier for a company to just say, we're going to cut you a check and we'll pay you the cash allowance. And then there's really nothing else for us to administer to you, the employee, in terms of services and benefits. Combining that with that fourth point that you see there, known expenditure, easy to budget. Again, from the corporate perspective, a lump sum is a known expenditure. It's an amount that's known up front, likely to not change. In some cases, the employee might come back and ask for more money, but that's usually not going to be granted. So the company knows, or even just the individual business unit knows up front how much money they're going to be spending on that relocation. Coming to that third point that we see there, competitive talent market, that definitely is true. We are, even now, while the economy has dipped a little with our current situation, we have seen thus far and over the past several months a very competitive talent market and a great increase in terms of demand for talent. Some might say that a lump sum is preferred by some of those younger employees, younger generations, simply along the lines of what Russ mentioned just a little bit ago, those individuals who are moving with fewer moving parts. So not a lot of household goods, no family members, less complexity with regards to their move. Those generations or those populations might prefer a lump sum. There's a question mark after that because we don't necessarily know that for sure. Probably individuals, and as we'll share in just a moment with our productivity study data, probably those individuals, especially if they've not moved before, they're not expecting much more in terms of a fully loaded relocation package. But I don't know that we could say with 100% certainty that those populations would prefer or do prefer a lump sum benefit. Moving on, let's talk about the flip side of this. So in what ways are lump sum maybe not our friend? And some of the negative sides of lump sum benefits that we need to think about. In terms of compliance, employer duty of care, when we're talking about domestic moves, so moves that are not crossing an international border, even though we aren't dealing with those immigration or tax compliance issues, there is still the issue of employer duty of care and basically taking care of that employee, making sure that that employee is receiving the benefits and services that they need to receive to make their move successful and to help that employee be productive. We've talked, even just over the past couple of slides, about these younger employees, inexperienced hires, fresh out of college. And those may be the populations that would prefer a lump sum, but at the same time, those are also the populations that have the least amount of experience in terms of relocation and moving for a job. So, the question then comes to play in terms of what is the employer's responsibility to ensure that that employee is being supported. In terms of tracking, if you pay, obviously, a cash lump sum to an employee, that's probably the last you see or hear of it. So the company really doesn't have any way to track that payment or to understand where and how the employee spent those funds. Just coming from my personal experience in working with all of our clients, all of Altair's clients across our entire client base, we've definitely heard those stories of employees who said, well, I got a lump sum and I thought it would be great to buy myself a new TV or some new clothes. And then I got really into the meat of my move or the relocation and realized I didn't have enough money to support my basic needs from a relocation standpoint. So obviously there's one negative side of a lump sum. And then that last one there is really what I was talking about in terms of employer duty of care, providing real support. And that's not necessarily providing strict and structured benefits to an employee, but even just providing somebody to talk to the employee and guide them through the process and work with them in terms of how best to spend those dollars. So it may not necessarily be not delivering a lump sum at all, but delivering a lump sum, but at least ensuring that that employee still has advocates that they can reach out to and individuals that they can work with that help support their move. So I think now we're going to actually move into the main portion of our presentation, and that's the opportunity for us to share some data and insights from our recent Momentum productivity study. So I do want to talk briefly just to provide a refresher as to why we as an organization took it upon ourselves to study employee productivity. And this was actually a journey that we began several years ago. We kind of as a smaller group came together and realized that there really wasn't any true statistics within the mobility industry to quantify or validate if there is an employee productivity loss during relocation, and if there is, what that looks like. So we really help companies understand where are your employees losing productivity during the relocation process. And again, put some hard and fast numbers around that and help companies to understand where in the process productivity is being lost the most, and then also work with those companies to find solutions, identify process improvements, potentially apply program and policy enhancements to help address those areas where the productivity drain is the worst. And one final piece that we wanted to tag onto this ambitious venture that we embarked upon several years ago was to really actually put a dollar figure up against that productivity loss and be able to show companies what the financial impact is when you're talking about productivity loss during an employee relocation. So that's really why we launched this study. Next, I think I'm going to hand it over to Russ, and Russ is going to share some highlights from the first 2 iterations of the productivity study series. So Russ, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Mary Beth. The first survey in our series was focused on employees that had recently moved under a full service domestic relocation policy, so domestic U.S., and we had a great response, 546 respondents, a nice mix of homeowners versus renters, and most of those respondents had actually transferred with their family. So we got a great representation of a wide range of move experiences domestically. And the results were really telling. Homeowners on average lost 19.8 days of work productivity. And that's really the cumulative impact of what we asked them to rank in terms of high productivity impacts on their mobility experience. Their renter counterparts lost a bit less at 15.6 days of lost work productivity. And we, in that survey asked these respondents to rank activities in their mobility experience in terms of those that had the highest productivity impacts. And what we found were that things like finding the destination community, securing the destination residence, disposing of the departure home, arranging for household goods transport, and concerns about job training and employee orientation and professional development as related to that relocation experience, those were the items that came in that domestic survey as having the highest impact on work productivity. When we look at the next survey in the series, which was our international study, we had 149 respondents. Similarly, most of those international transferees and assignees were moving with a spouse or partner or their family. Half of those, surprisingly, had no international relocation experience previously. So lots of people coming into that move experience with little background to relocation. So that was interesting. And 90% were existing employees. So most companies dedicating their investment to international relocation to those employees they've had on board for a while. Those respondents moved from 52 different departure locations and moved to 30 different destination locations. So a nice global mix of respondents in that survey. And just some quick notes on the results of that survey. On average, respondents reported 24.4 days of lost productivity as a result of that international mobility experience. And again, that's the cumulative impact of those high impact activities, those that took more than 3 days of job focus away from that employee. Some of the strongest or highest productivity impact activities were finding and selecting the appropriate residence or home in the new location, establishing a residence, but also all those other logistical pieces that kind of come under the umbrella of settling in services, things like obtaining driver's license and setting up bank accounts, securing utilities and the local registrations. All of those things were reported as a high impact activity, as were coordinating and managing the immigration process. So all of those kind of came in that international study as a high impact activity. So Mary Beth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Russ. I did want to share some insights into what the survey looked like. So what did we actually ask these employees as part of the survey? We really wanted to dig deeper than just those relocation-related activities, which are those activities that you see here in that middle column. These are all the pretty basic components of a relocation, right? Preparing, marketing, selling a departure area residence, transitioning into temporary housing, managing relocation funds and expenses, settling into the new community, etc. You can see their household goods move. We also wanted to ask the employees about their productivity loss as it related to some work activities or activities that were more related to their actual employment, and then also those personal or those more of those soft activities, soft subjects that sometimes get missed in terms of the grand scheme of an employee relocation. So some of the work-related activities included, what happened to you during the decision-making process? How much time did that take, both from a personal standpoint and a financial standpoint? What was your experience in terms of communicating and interacting with the internal departments within your organization that supported that relocation process? And then the one that really, to me, I think when we went into this whole series and launched the very first study, we added that bullet in that first column that says adapting to the new work environment from a social cultural perspective. I don't think any of us that were kind of the core team that worked on this study series expected that particular activity to rank so high in terms of productivity loss. So I'll get into that. Russ and I will both get into that a little bit more later. On that right column, you can see those personal and family-related activities. So some of the ones that we know occur and transpire during a relocation process, but we probably don't ask employees enough as to how those particular events impacted them. So communicating and managing family issues during periods of separation. So times when the employee maybe is in temporary living and the family is back still in the origin location. Researching and managing educational requirements for handling spouse and family transition challenges related to just the relocation, as well as spousal employment issues. And then making decisions regarding elders. We didn't want to leave that out. And while on all three studies, the percentage of individuals who moved with elders was relatively small, we did get some feedback from survey respondents that there were some issues that they faced. Some of those being, of course, the sandwich generation, moving with children and elders in tow. Russ, I'm going to pass it along to you to talk a little bit about our activity rating that we established for the surveys.
Sure. Thanks, Mary Beth. I think one of the decisions we recognized that we needed to make early in designing the studies, the momentum studies, was we had to have a methodology around how to quantify consistently the productivity impact of all the various activities that people engage in as they relocate or transfer on an assignment. And our methodology for doing that was to give respondents 3 choices to rank all of those activities that we know are part of a mobility experience. And they were asked to either rank those activities as a high impact item, which is defined as those activities that, in that employee's perception, caused 3 or more days combined of lost productivity. By contrast, they could also rank a particular activity as a low impact item, and that would be one that caused fewer than 3 days of combined lost productivity. And then, of course, we also recognize the need to allow respondents to opt into a not applicable response. So maybe that activity did not pertain to their particular relocation experience, wasn't part of what they had to go through to transfer. So that was the third option. And the result of that activity rating was to help us, again, take the results that we got from the survey and begin to assign real hard numbers, quantifiable numbers to the productivity impacts of all of these activities. So Mary Beth, I'll, without further ado, now let you talk about Momentum, the latest iteration of that survey and some of the results.
Great. Thank you, Russ. And I will say, just going back over those last 2 slides that Russ and I covered, the one where we shared the multitude of questions or activities that we asked employees to rank and having the employees rank those activities based on the scale that Russ just shared. we really didn't vary the questions significantly between all three studies, the full benefits U.S. domestic, the full benefits international, and then the lump sum U.S. domestic. And we made minor modifications, obviously, because for the international study, as an example, we wanted to include a question around the immigration process and cultural and language challenges. But for the most part, we kept the questions or the activities and the way we described them fairly homogeneous. And that was really so that we could, over the span of the multiple years that we've been conducting these studies, so that we were able to have a really good comparison between what happens to an employee that moves with a full benefits package versus an employee that moves just with a lump sum. So let's jump in. Our U.S. domestic lump sum study, I want to just start out with some high-level participant information. As I think we've pretty much well established, we surveyed employees who moved under a lump sum only policy within the domestic United States. So these employees did not receive a lump sum plus. All they received was a lump sum cash benefit without any other extraneous benefits provided. We had a total of 169 individuals respond to the survey, but only 159 of those indicated that their move was complete. And this is an interesting point that I want to touch on just briefly. In the two previous momentum surveys, because we surveyed individuals who were relocated under full benefits relocation packages, we actually had data to clearly identify when that individual's move was considered complete. So what we did in those prior two surveys was we utilized the date of delivery of the household goods to determine the quote-unquote end date or final date for their relocation. And then we were able to say, okay, let's let a few months lapse from that date of delivery of the household goods before we survey the individuals, so that we know that they have some good perspective looking back on their move. In this particular survey, we didn't necessarily have that data because these individuals were given a lump sum. So while some of them might have booked formal household goods moves through Altair, the majority of them didn't, so we didn't have data to show us when their household goods were delivered. With that, we added a specific question to this particular survey, asking them, based on a list of different scenarios and criteria, if they could tell us that their move was complete. And some of those were things like, my family, if applicable, has relocated permanently to the new location. We are settled in our permanent residence. My household goods and personal effects have been delivered to my primary permanent residence in the new location. So interestingly, we had 10 respondents who indicated that their move was not complete. And we did not count their responses, as we really did want to have a population of responses and respondents who had completed their moves in order to ensure that our data was, again, homogeneous and valid. So we had 26 telephone interviews that were conducted post-survey. And I will say, just going back and looking at the prior two momentum surveys, we did also have telephone interviews that we conducted after those surveys were completed. We invited every survey respondent to opt in or opt out of a live telephone interview. And the vast majority, quite honestly, opted in to proceed further along in the process and participate in a live telephone interview, which we had conducted for all three studies by an external consultant. We had individuals who moved from 35 different departure states within the U.S. and who moved to 32 different destination states. And on the heat map there, you'll see some of the more common destination states were California, Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Illinois. We also saw some concentration in Georgia and Florida, and you can see some various other destination states there. Moving on, let's just talk a little bit about the respondent demographics of the lump sum survey. The vast majority of respondents were single or moving alone, and the vast majority were renters versus homeowners. So you can see those statistics there. Family size, employee only were 51% of the respondents, and then 29% were employee plus spouse and partner. Only 16% were individuals who moved with a spouse, partner, and additional family members. That, to me, is a good statistic. because just from my personal experience, and I'm sure Russ would agree, that once you get to a point where you're moving individuals with family members and who own homes, lump sums may not be the best option for you. And we're certainly going to show you how the data from this particular study supports that. As you'll see there, 71% were renters and 29% were homeowners. Another interesting statistic that's not on the particular slide, of the 30% of respondents who had previously relocated, so only 30% of our respondents had moved before for a job, only 17% of those had experienced more than 2 previous corporate relocations. So pretty much on the whole, our respondents were very inexperienced individuals in terms of relocation. So let's talk a little bit about some of the initial statistics or the data that we received out of the study data. As you can see here, we did ask the respondents to tell us what the net lump sum was that they received. So we were very careful to say we want to know the net amount of cash that you received in your pocket. 53% indicated they received a lump sum of between $5,000 and $15,000. 32% received a lump sum of less than $5,000, and you can see there 15% received a lump sum of greater than $15,000. And we did have a couple of respondents who received more than $20,000 in terms of their lump sum. Below that, what you're going to see is a little bit of a busy chart, but really what we wanted to look at is how those lump sum amounts related to resident status and family size. And in doing this, we wanted to try to validate whether companies are taking some sort of employee demographics and criteria into account when determining the lump sum amount that is being provided. So as you'll see there, which I think is a very, very positive trend that we identified from the survey data, was that as the family size increased, so for the most part, so did the amount of the lump sums that those employees received. We also saw that homeowners tended to receive larger lump sums than renters, and the number of renters, as you can see there, that received less than $5,000 greatly exceeded the number of homeowners. So again, what this tells us is for a lot of the companies that were represented in this study, they did take into account whether the individual had a family and whether they owned or rented a residence with regards to the amount of lump sum that they received. And for me, that's a very positive result that we saw from the study. Russ, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk a little bit about the highest impact activities from the study.
Thanks, Mary Beth. As with the previous 2 Momentum surveys, we looked at the top relocation activities rated as being highly impactful to the employee's work productivity. And as you can see here on the slide, the high impact activities are for the most part quite consistent with what we saw in prior Momentum surveys. For this group, for the lump sum group, the highest impact activity was reported as finding the appropriate destination community. And likewise with the international survey that came in quite high at 66%, U.S. domestic full service policy or full benefits policy recipients also rated that very high at 58%. So that's definitely across the board a challenge that all relocating employees, regardless of policy type, are reporting as a high impact activity. Likewise, in the lump sum survey, arranging household goods transportation also was ranked at 53% as a high impact activity. And that is very similar to the other 2 surveys. International respondents reported that at a rate of 45%. And U.S. domestic full benefit policy recipients reported that at a rate of 42%. Securing a destination location residence was ranked as a high impact activity by 41% of lump sum recipients. International policy recipients rated that high at 61%. Probably not surprising, recognizing somebody moving to an international location would struggle with establishing that destination location residence. And U.S. Domestic full benefit respondents came in at 49% on that activity. And then lastly, lump sum respondents, about a third reported that the job training and employee orientation and onboarding process was a high impact activity. That's pretty well consistent with the other surveys. That was ranked 26% by international transferees and at 38% by U.S. domestic policy recipients that moved under a full benefit policy. So overall, very consistent results, but some nuances and some differences with lump sum recipients, as you can see. So Mary Beth, I'll turn it back to you, and I think we're going to cover some of the top productivity drains.
Yes, great. Thank you, Russ. Yeah, and I want to just back on the slide that Russ just covered, was providing some of the high-level statistics and an overview of the first two studies. You might have seen the term or the words "at least." So we had a couple slides where we talked about the individuals lost at least this many days. And one thing I want to point out on that, if you recall back a few slides, we talked about the rating scale that we utilized and asking the employee whether each of these activities were high impact or low impact. When you see those words "at least," that is really a very true statement. And the numbers, a lot of the figures that we have and that we're sharing around the days lost are conservative in nature. And the rationale behind that is some of those figures were really just taking into account those activities that were ranked as high impact. So those activities that caused employees to lose 3 or more days of work. In some of those data points, we didn't even count the low impact responses. So if you recall, low impact items were those that caused the employee to lose less than 3 days. And so in some cases, we just compiled the data from the high impact responses. And when we did that, we counted those high impact responses as only causing each employee to lose 3 days. Where we know, based on how we defined the rating scale, that those high impact activities cause the employees to realistically lose at least or a minimum of 3 days. Any one of those employees might have lost 4, 5, or 6 days on any of those activities. So throughout all of this and throughout the whole presentation, I just want to point out that a lot of these figures are conservative in nature because we just used the bare minimum number of days to calculate the days lost. So with that said, let's look at the top 10 productivity drains. And this data is a little different because this is actually combining high impact and low impact responses to come to an overall impact of that particular activity. And you'll see at the very top, arranging household goods, transportation, packing, and delivery. That was, I believe, second in terms of just high impacts. But once we added in those low impact responses, so individuals that said, yeah, this did impact my productivity, probably less than 3 days, but it still was an impact. That brought us up to a full 93% of respondents who indicated that arranging their household goods transportation caused them to lose at least some work focus. Finding the appropriate destination residential community came in at 91%. And I quite honestly, in comparison to the domestic and international studies, these figures were significantly higher. So when we combined the high and low impact, we got into these 90 percentiles and 80 percentiles with far more activities with the lump sum study than we did with the U.S. domestic and the international studies. So I think that's very important to point out. While not all of these were high from a high impact perspective, when we add in those low impact responses, they were significantly impactful. Just a few I want to point out that were unique to this particular study. Adapting to the new work environment from a social and cultural perspective was very, very interesting to see, coming in at number 4 at, I believe, 89%. And I think that speaks a lot to the fact that a lot of the individuals that responded to this study were very inexperienced movers, and many of them were new hires. And probably very early on in their career. And if you just think about the stress that an individual feels, and if anybody that is listening to this webinar and you think about your very first job and your first day walking into an office and the stress of that, and trying to find your social circle within the office and adapt yourself to whatever culture your first organization had, that's a pretty challenging step to take in terms of mobility and the relocation process. Managing relocation funds and expenses, that's down there at 85%. Again, far more low impact responses on that one than high impact, but obviously very impactful, especially given that these individuals were pretty much left to manage their own relocation funds and expenses. And then I thought it was interesting as well that the decision-making process to accept the move simply from a financial perspective also came in extremely high. So next, I just want to touch on how we looked at productivity loss based on the actual lump sum amount. And this was also some interesting data that we extracted from the survey. I think most of us, and when I hand the mic back to Russ, I'll let him share his thoughts on this as well. I think most of us who worked or were intimately involved in the survey anticipated that the less money an employee received in terms of their lump sum, the more productivity or more days of lost work time they would have. And the exact opposite ended up being true when we dug into the data. As you can see here, for those individuals who received a net lump sum of less than $5,000, they lost at a minimum 26 days of productivity, work productivity. You can also see there at the bottom, which we did expect, a much larger percentage of this population had to dig into their personal funds to finish paying for all of their relocation-related expenses. Only 18% of those individuals had funds left over. When we jump up into the next category, so individuals who received a net lump sum of between $5,000 and $15,000, that productivity loss went up one additional day, so 27 days. But you can see there's more of an even split between individuals that had to dig into their personal funds, into their pockets to pay for relocation expenses versus those that had funds left over. And then finally, when we look at the population that received a lump sum, a net lump sum of greater than $15,000, that productivity loss jumped up to 31 days, which really surprised us. But it was also very interesting when we looked through the data more in depth and then also obviously conducted the telephone interviews and got some additional anecdotal data and feedback. As you can see there, for that population, a much larger percentage, 46% has funds left over, but still 33% of those individuals had to utilize personal funds for some of their relocation expenses. And I believe at the end of the webinar, we're going to share some information on how we can get you a copy of the overall study report, so the formal published study report. And in there, you'll see some additional data around what those actual expenses were that these respondents and these employees had to spend their personal funds on. It's very, very insightful. Next, I want to talk a little bit about our telephone interview feedback. And again, we conducted 26 live telephone interviews for those employees or survey respondents that opted in. Most of the comments from the survey respondents who participated in those live telephone interviews focused around settling into the new location, finding that destination housing, managing and overseeing the shipment of household goods, including engaging with a vetted, reputable moving company. And I'll get to that in just a moment. And then also we saw some issues related to spouse and family adjustment. When we asked the telephone individuals what would have helped to reduce their lost productivity, a lot of the responses focused on receiving more robust resources earlier on in the process, most notably during their decision-making process. And if you recall back when we talked about the top 10 productivity drains, that decision-making process was pretty impactful to the employee's work productivity. Other areas to note include receiving more support for trailing spouse or partner employment and activities, support for securing housing in the destination, but also having a point of contact to assist with the coordination of services and benefits and suppliers. And then obviously, not surprisingly, at least to me, a lot of individuals expressed that they would have very much appreciated help in identifying vetted, reputable household goods movers. So these comments, along with the hard data that we got, really affirm what I think many of us in the mobility industry inherently feel about lump sum only relocation programs. So while some companies assume that simply cutting an employee a check and giving them that flexibility to manage their own move is great, what they are often missing are the tools and resources and even just checklists to assist that employee in making those sound, educated decisions related to their move. So Russ, let's talk a little bit, I'm going to pass it back to you again to talk a little bit about balancing flexibility and that employee experience, which we know is so very critical and important.
Absolutely. I could not agree more, Mary Beth, with what you stated earlier about the surprise that we had from the results when we saw that what we presumed might be a correlation between providing employees with more funds would have an impact on lessening productivity drain, and we actually saw the opposite. But if you really think about it, I think it's great ammunition for mobility teams to be able to kind of counter that misperception within their organizations that just simply giving folks more money is going to satisfy all of the complexity, all of those complex needs for hand-holding and services that come along. And so I really appreciate you pointing that out. But in terms of balancing flexibility and the employee experience, we mentioned earlier the different ways a company might pay out a lump sum. We mentioned that there's this traditional method where a cash allowance is paid directly to the employee. And under that approach, the employee is responsible for controlling their move and managing all the relocation details and arrangements. The employee in that scenario has 100% flexibility in how their lump sum funds are spent. What we're showing on this slide is, I guess you could say, a sort of an emotional seesaw or balancing act with regards to the different approaches for paying out lump sums. When we look at employees' reaction to receiving a cash lump sum allowance, we see that in many cases that employee is very happy when they find out that they're getting a check from their company. We also know that in some cases that happiness is because the employee is planning to use those funds to purchase something new, like a TV or some other shiny object. Up front they get that money and it's kind of a spending spree. This often happens with a new employee or an employee who has never relocated before. And remember how many inexperienced folks we showed in our demographics. Unfortunately, as the employee moves through the relocation process, that initial happiness can often fade as the employee faces the real complexities of their move and maybe realizes the expenses involved in a relocation are much more impactful to them than they thought. Sometimes the employee ends up with a less than stellar experience and may even result in the employee going back to their employer to request additional funds. Now, with a managed lump sum or managed budget approach, the employee's initial response may not be as 100% positive when they realize they're not actually receiving any type of cash payment. However, with a managed lump sum approach, the employee maintains a significant level of control over the process with input and support from a relocation consultant. And in this scenario, the employee receives referrals to vetted, reputable suppliers, as well as focused and customized counseling regarding the services and benefits that are likely to provide that employee with more, quote unquote, bang for their buck. These may be things like destination services or home finding support, assistance for their spouse or partner with employment resources, etc. Many of these services and benefits are ones that the Momentum Lump Sum telephone interviewees that Mary Beth just shared noted would have been helpful and likely would have reduced that employee's lost productivity. So definitely something to consider when we talk about those methodologies of paying out lump sums for a traditional approach versus a managed lump sum. Lots of pros and cons to consider. So with that, Mary Beth, I'll turn it back over to you to share some key insights from our latest survey.
Great. Thanks for that, Russ. Let's look at some of the key insights. We'll kind of close it out with this. I think we can all agree lump sums can be beneficial. I, for one, do not think that lump sums are ever going to go away. And I do feel like they're not always the wrong solution. They can work. They can be beneficial if they're utilized to support the appropriate employee populations. I've said more than once, I think, throughout this presentation that once you get into situations where you have employees that are moving with family or have a home to sell or have a lot of baggage, both literally and figuratively, a lump sum may not be the best approach for those individuals. But employees who are earlier on in their career, they're single, they're moving with minimal personal belongings, these are the employees that say, I just have a couple boxes, or I have a backpack that I'm going to throw on my back and I'm just going to hop in my car and get to the new location. So those are the ones that you might see benefiting and really being an okay population to provide a lump sum to. So we are seeing more companies move toward, or at least begin to explore, the utilization of that managed budget that Russ referenced on that last slide versus just paying out a cash lump sum. especially given a lot of the technological advances that we know are out there today. And from an Altair perspective, we have developed and implemented a pretty robust online budget management tool for these employees. A lot of our clients are seeing the benefits and the positives of, instead of paying out that cash lump sum, saying to the employee, we're going to give you this amount of money that Altair is going to work with you and help you spend. So that gives, again, to Russ's point, as he said on the last slide, the employee still maintains a level of control over those funds, but they do receive that hand-holding and that consulting and that advocacy in terms of having a relocation consultant to help them spend those funds through a managed budget versus just giving them a check. Another interesting insight was that employees moving with just a spouse or partner had the highest productivity loss. And we thought that was very interesting. The productivity loss for that population was even greater than employees moving with a spouse, partner, and additional family members, 32 days versus 30 days. So our assessment of that is that this is probably likely due to the phase of life that these employees are in. A lot of those employees are probably younger. They're earlier on in their relationship. They may be far more dependent on dual employment or dual income lifestyle. And so in those types of scenarios, spouse counseling or employment counseling for that spouse partner is even more important. Quite honestly, it's probably not something that an employee would typically invest in on their own. So if they're given a cash lump sum, they might not even know that those resources and services are out there. So again, another benefit of providing a managed budget. But it was very interesting to see that this was the population that had the highest productivity loss versus those that were moving with additional family members. And then another surprising result or insight that we gained from the study was that employees who had moved previously or were existing employees lost more productivity than those with no previous relocation experience. And again, I think we went into the survey thinking that the less money you got and if you've never moved before, you probably lost more productivity because you're not really experienced with the relocation process. And just the opposite was true. And we really talked through this and determined that in many ways, we think that individuals who had moved previously or were existing employees just simply had higher expectations with regards to the relocation benefits that they were going to receive. Some of these employees, as we found out through the telephone surveys or the telephone interviews, were individuals who'd moved previously with another company and possibly received a more robust benefits package. So when they were handed a cash lump sum, they were probably a little lost with regards to how to do that because they'd received a different level of support with a previous move. And as such, they ended up with more productivity loss than those who really came into this with no expectations because they were new hires or they did not have a previous relocation to refer back to. So they were probably just excited to be getting any type of support, even if it was just a cash lump sum, and as such, did not lose as much productivity throughout the process. So I think on our next slide is just some information on where to access some of the data and insights from our overarching momentum series, so all three studies through the Altair Global website. And then, Sarah, I'm going to pass it back to you as I believe we've reached the end of the information that we're going to share. I think we might have some questions that we had pulled in previously.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mary Beth and Russ. I appreciate it. We do have some time for some questions today. This is a pre-recorded webinar. However, Mary Beth has presented this same presentation previously where audience members did ask questions, and we found a couple of these that would be helpful for you today. So let's start with this one. As more companies have access to this type of data, do you anticipate the use of lump sums to decrease?
So I'll jump in on that one. Thank you, Sarah. And yes, that was a question actually that I received the last time that I presented this data to a group, a regional group, actually up in Massachusetts. Actually, one of the corporate attendees asked this question. And I thought it was an interesting question. And I said, you know, I do feel that the more companies that see this data, but, you know, not just see the data, but that digest this data and are able to dig into it and read some of the commentary from the telephone interviews, that yes, we might see some companies pull back a little bit on those lump sums, especially again, and I know I've probably sound like a broken record at this point, I've stressed this so many times, but especially with regards to those populations of employees with families and with houses and homes to sell and more household goods to move and just more complexities related to their move. Do I think lump sums will go away entirely? No. I also know that just speaking to our clients and the companies whose employees participated in the survey, this is very useful data that is very helpful and beneficial to take higher up into the organization. I've spoken with more than one company just over the past few months that says, well, we have a senior leader who just believes in lump sums. He or she thinks this is just the way to go. It's easier for us. All those things that we talked about earlier in terms of how lump sums can be friends. I've had a lot of mobility contacts say to me, I really need some data to share with this senior leader who just seems dead set on lump sums across the board. And that's where I think this data is going to prove useful. Do I think it'll be an immediate shift that a lot of companies will just get away with a lot of their lump sum programs? Absolutely not. It's a process. It's a change in culture. But I do think that this data is significantly important and very, very useful for corporations.
Great. Thank you for that, Mary Beth. I think we have time for one more question here. So let's go ahead and go with this one here. Why was the response rate for the lump sum survey lower than the others?
That was interesting as well. I think that we thought when we conducted the international study, we expected a bit of a lower response rate. But given the number of surveys that we sent out for this particular study, and there were a lot, we got a lower response rate than we expected. Thankfully, it was still close to, I believe, 19 or 20%, which was above what is typical for this type of survey. So we feel very confident, obviously, in the data. But it was a lower response rate than I think we originally thought we would get. But when we started again to explore the data and explore the feedback that we were getting from respondents and dive into the telephone interview commentary, we determined that there were probably a lot of people that received the invitation for the survey and then thought, I don't really know why I'm being surveyed about my quote unquote relocation, because they didn't perceive themselves as having been formally relocated. A lot of them, I think, went into this, and we verified this with some of the corporate participants. A lot of them probably received the invitation to the survey, and although that was really coming from their organization versus Altair, they thought, I don't know that I should be answering this because I didn't receive a formal relocation package. All I got was a check, or I got a lump sum. And so that was kind of our rationale as to why we felt the response rate was a tad bit lower, was just simply the perception of the employees that received the lump sum. They just didn't feel that them answering a survey around a formal relocation was applicable. So it is a great question, and I have had that question come up multiple times when I've presented these results at different regional conferences. So thanks, Sarah, for including those.
Interesting. Absolutely. Well, you guys, I think that is about all the time we have for today. As we mentioned at the beginning, this webinar has been approved for HRCI and GMS CRP credit. The CRP credit, as you can see there, is 16108, and the HRCI credit is 515968. From all of us at Altair Global, we want to thank you for attending our webinar and have a great rest of your day.